As the death toll from the Israel-Hamas conflict continues to grow on both sides, the conditions in Gaza remain catastrophic. Hospitals are under pressure and they say they'll run out of fuel from their generators within hours. For 5 days, Gaza more broadly has been without power, and food and water is being rationed. Egypt is being pressured to reopen its border crossing at Rafah to allow more aid into the Gaza Strip and allow civilians to leave. Joining me live now is Palestinian author and peace activist Aziz Abu Sara. Aziz, thanks so much for your time. I don't think there's any moral equivalence to the horrors that we saw in southern Israel perpetrated by terrorists in the early hours of the morning on the 7th of October. But what is happening in Gaza is still a human catastrophe. Have you still got family and friends there?
Yeah, I do. And I think it's the biggest mistake we often do in our conflict in general is trying to compare pain and trying to compare who suffered more and who had more loss of life. I do have friends there. I have friends also here who have families there. One of them who I talked to just today said it's been 3 days. She's unable to locate her family, doesn't know if they're alive or dead. I have few friends who already lost family members in the bombings. And the people there, like you mentioned, there is no electricity. I mean, in general, Gaza gets 4 hours on good days of electricity, and now it's pretty much down to nothing. Internet, phone services are pretty much down, which is why people aren't able to reach their families. And people can't leave. They are told to evacuate, but there isn't really much place to leave. Gaza is already extremely dense place.
Yeah, it certainly is. And look, you speak of being unable to contact your family and friends, and we had tried to speak to so many people inside of Gaza, and their internet service is just not able to allow that to happen. We can't even contact them on the phones now. So that, matters in the propaganda war as well. But Aziz, can you give us some kind of idea about, general Palestinian support for Hamas? Is it widespread, or are people quite silent about it?
I think it's a lot more complicated than yes or no. I mean, Hamas came to power in 2006 after an election. The people who voted for Hamas, most of them are not around anymore. 70+% of Palestinians are under 35 years old, didn't even get to vote in those elections. But how is Hamas now popular or less popular? I think in the last 20 plus years, there's two factions that are fighting for power in Palestine, Fatah and Hamas, the PA and Hamas. And the PA has not been able to really bring any political development for Palestinians. Hamas in the last 20 years, some Palestinians look at it and say every round of violence it had with Israel actually conceded to Hamas certain things. And that unfortunately only strengthened Hamas. So it's a lot more complicated than why are people in love with Hamas or not. Also, a reminder, Hamas is an authoritarian regime. It's not a democracy. You don't go out and protest against an authoritarian regime. So you don't see really how much support there is or isn't of Hamas.
In places like Gaza, you are not going to have a nuanced debate, which we're allowed to have on this very program. So Palestinians would be getting a lot of propaganda, I imagine, from Hamas. Israel consistently painted as evil terrorists themselves by Hamas. So, the Palestinian people are the real victims here.
Yeah, and I think, look, in reality, if people see bombs falling out of the sky, they know these bombs are falling from Israel. So they are definitely not in love with the state of Israel. But also, when people want to leave, they blame Israel for their inability to leave.
Well, just on that,
Unfortunately,
Aziz, just on that, can I ask you about this? Because we have Egypt unwilling to take any Palestinian refugees or any Arab neighbours. Why not?
Because I can explain to you the reasoning. I think for Egypt, they are very concerned that if they take any refugees, Israel will not allow those refugees back. Last time that happened was in 1967. My uncle was one of them, ended up in Jordan. He is not allowed to come back to Palestine since then, to the West Bank. And so Egypt is looking at it. We can take refugees, and then Israel won't allow them. They'll be displaced forever. That's also, by the way, was why a lot of people in the north of Gaza are refusing to move to the south of Gaza after Israel has asked them to do so, because they're afraid that if they move, Israel will come in, build settlements, and they'll never be able to go back to their homes. And based on historical events, that could happen. There are even voices in Israel, like Moshe Feiglin, former Knesset member, part of the Likud, who's calling for that. He's calling it, this should be an operation of displacement and building settlements. And that's, even if it's not the Israeli government policies now, that does terrify a lot of people in Gaza.
Just finally, Aziz, when this attack first happened on the 7th of October, a lot of people reached for justification first rather than empathy for the Israeli people living in the south, these young people at the festival, families, children in southern Israel. What is your view on that? Are you able to both condemn the actions of Hamas and condemn the actions of Israel's retaliation?
I think it's really important when we see civilians suffer, we sympathize and feel the pain regardless. We don't ask what's your nationality, what's your religion, what's your ethnicity, so I can decide if I feel for you or not. Look, this is personal for me. I have friends, I have Jewish friends, Israeli friends. I'm a peace activist. These people who are hurt are people who I know personally. I have a friend who still hasn't been found. We think she is in Gaza. I know people who've been killed. And I have many, many Israeli friends who lost family members. By the way, not only Jewish, also Arab friends, Palestinian friends in the south of Israel. One of them is a son of a fellow peacemaker who was a ambulance driver and a medic who refused to leave when he saw people being injured and went to help and eventually was killed for it.
Was that your friend? Was that your friend, Aziz?
The father is.
I've seen that story. Yeah. So he speaks Arabic, he's Palestinian. He thought that he could actually negotiate with the terrorists. Is that right?
We know, I don't know the exact details of how he was killed, but I know when he was told to leave the event because he had the ambulance, he refused and he said, there are people here who needs my help and I'm going to stay to help. And he paid his life trying to save the Jewish people there. And I think this is really important because often it gets painted into Jews versus Muslims or Jews versus Palestinians. And it's not that simple of an us versus them. If we look at this story, and there are few or many other stories like this, maybe we have to redefine it a little bit. I don't see us always on opposite sides. In many cases, we're not. I see it as those of us, Israelis and Palestinians, who are together for justice and for peace, and those who are not there yet. And still, like, I'll tell you just one anecdote. Today, an Israeli friend of mine called me and said, I just need somebody to cry with. And he is heartbroken for what's happening in Gaza. He's heartbroken for what happened in Israel. We both don't like Hamas and honestly don't like the Israeli government. And we think we are where we are because our governments have done very little to stop and to come to a deal and finish this conflict, which we could have, and it's totally possible long time ago. And now we all paying the price for that not being done.
And there are many young victims and citizens right in the middle of that. Aziz, it's been a pleasure to talk to you today. We really thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.